Welcome to Teachers Talk Texts, the podcast where English teachers share their insights and interpretations of texts currently studied in PCE English. I'm your host, Clare Mackey. Let's dive into today's episode. Hello, Prue. Thank you so much for coming on Teachers Talk Texts. I'm really excited to have you here. And today we're going to talk all things Pride and Prejudice.
Oh, thanks for having me, Claire. I'm a little bit excited about this.
Absolutely. So I thought I'd start where I have traditionally been starting and ask you, why do you love this text? What is it about P&P that just makes your heart sing?
Well, look, to be honest, I was very late to the Austen love. As a teenager, I was really more into the whole Gothic, Brontes were my favourite, and so I stayed away from Austen. And it wasn't until about 4 years ago, when it ended up on a text list for literature, that I was like, oh, okay, I've got to sit down and read this. And I think I spent far more time berating myself for not having read the book sooner than anything else, because I was just enamoured with the humour that sits behind everything. This is you can look at Pride and Prejudice from a really thematic commentary on Victorian society and how women should be behaving and what makes a good match and all of that sort of stuff. But at the end of the day, it's really just a humorous, light-hearted look at what could have been different. I don't know.
No, I like that. I think it's often called a novel of manners.
Yes.
That's a really good way to describe it. So basically, this really detailed observation of customs and values in its time. I was reading recently about Pride and Prejudice, and someone identified that the time that Jane Austen was writing this novel was a really significant historical period. I think she starts writing in late 1700s. You've got the French Revolution, you've got Marie Antoinette being guillotined, you've got Napoleon coming into power. And there's all these other writers at the time who are really preoccupied with making a commentary on this. But yet, as you say, Austen writes this novel of a really domestic situation. So I guess I ask you, do you have any thoughts on why she might have focused so, well, not in a small way, but on kind of ignored what was going on for her historically?
I don't think she ignored it, though. That's the thing. There's still present in there is still this, and I guess I have a tendency to read from a very feminist perspective. So
Love that. I'm all
looking,
about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I come to P&P with that kind of feminist perspective, and I don't think that Austen herself was trying to be feminist, because that idea didn't exist when she was writing. But she's certainly focused on what was important to her, I suppose. And I guess that's probably the most important. As a writer, you get a lot of advice from people saying, write what you know.
Yes.
And I think that Austen's probably taken that and written what she knows, and written about the family and the women and how they're affected and influenced by all of those other things that are going on. The Brontes kind of did a very similar thing, but just in a different way.
They did. I mean, arguably they're all existing in a very similar social climate and social system of restriction through both gender and class, I think, and Austen's making or highlighting perhaps the restrictions placed on women in that time. But you're right, she does it in a slightly humorous way. There's elements of lightheartedness in amongst some pretty pointed criticism of her society. I think, I don't know about you, but I think of Charlotte Lucas as a really good example of that. And I guess, how do you feel about Charlotte and what, her journey being with Mr. Collins.
Yeah, look, I think Charlotte was kind of the scapegoat in the whole novel. Austen, I mean, Lizzie was proposed to originally by Collins,
Yes.
and it was that belief, and that he would be able to do that as well. And I think, like, I look at Collins, he's such a fluff character.
Yeah.
I don't think he's given enough credit.
He's trying to do the right thing, though, isn't he? I mean, he's obsequious and he's narcissistic and he's completely
oblivious.
Yes, completely oblivious as to his effect on everyone around him. But he identified the situation with the Bennet sisters, and he was trying to do the right thing.
Yeah, and I think I guess his intentions the whole way are very noble. Like, even his discussion about, Catherine de Bourgh and the fact that she's such an amazing person because she's given him all of this opportunity. His belief, I suppose, is very from the heart, but he's just so blinkered, I guess, by everything else that's going on around him. Like, he's a really insular kind of character. I don't want to say person.
Construction, yeah, because he's constructed purposefully by Austen to play that role.
Yeah, but I think if we connect that again with Charlotte, Charlotte's in the same position. She's connected to be, or she's constructed to be that role of dutiful daughter and woman and wife, and she just kind of ends up in the situation where it was expected that she was married. I mean, I think from memory, she was a little bit older than what she should have been when she was married. So there's kind of this, contextually speaking, she was at the end of her use by date, I suppose.
Yes, but facing being an old maid.
Yeah, so I think she kind of took on the role of Mrs. Collins as something that she had to do, and she recognised that. And I don't think Austen criticises her about doing that either. I think there's a real recognition that Charlotte was exactly what was expected of everyone, and so she lived up to that and she did that. And I guess that's maybe where the beauty of those two characters come in, is that they are like, here's what was expected and here's what happened, but then on the other side of the mirror is things like Lydia running off with Wickham and doing the complete opposite.
Right. She, I mean, on the topic of narcissism,
Yeah.
and obliviousness, I feel she has no idea about how her behaviour will impact the other sisters, especially Jane, who's, and Bingley. Are we positioned to hate her, or, Austen does manage to evoke contempt, perhaps, for a 16-year-old girl in a very effective manner? What are your thoughts?
I think that's a real contextual thing too. Like, I guess if you look at the 19th century when Austen was writing, then yes, Lydia would have been constructed as contemptuous. But I think from the 21st century perspective, and I also think this is like a really important discussion to have with your students as well, is to say, let's look at the difference between the context. Lydia then becomes just this absolutely hilarious commentary on normal behaviour of a 16-year-old girl. She doesn't, from our perspective, she doesn't do anything that's extraordinary. She likes Wickham, she wants him, she goes after him. Sidetrack.
No, please.
Have you read P.D. James's Death Comes to Pemberley?
I have read it, yes.
Have you seen the telly series?
I have not seen the telly series.
Okay, so as far as Pride and Prejudice goes,
yes,
the telly movies, that's 3 one-hour episodes of Death Comes to Pemberley. The actors that they employed for this particular show have got to be the best representations of the characters in Pride and Prejudice I have ever seen. And
That's a big
Lydia
call.
is,
I mean, are we saying Colin, come on, Colin Firth is Darcy
oh,
in the original BBC adaptation, just on the topic of a segue, a sidetrack.
look, if I have to say the best Darcy, the best film version Darcy is definitely Colin Firth. There's nothing, well, there is no one that is better than him.
No.
And I was going to do some research and find out actually what the actors' names were from this, and I didn't get a chance.
No,
But
that's
the
okay.
gentleman that plays Darcy in this, though, does do a very good job. The difference, I think, in Death Comes to Pemberley, Darcy's not actually a key character. He just kind of sits in the background a lot. So he doesn't have to be Colin Firth. So he kind of creates this beautiful, he's a really haunted Darcy that's, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, brain's gone.
That's okay.
Brooding, I suppose.
Brooding,
probably.
okay.
Yeah, brooding and moody, but he loves Elizabeth. Like because this is written sort of after the end of Pride and Prejudice. You can see his relationship with Elizabeth develop, and so that's, I think, what is beautiful about that. But the woman who plays Lydia is just this like screeching, squealing, oh my goodness, very spoilt and just so impeccably what I feel like when I read Pride and Prejudice, I see her as Lydia, and I think that makes a big difference to how I see the character of Lydia in Pride and Prejudice.
Well, I think you make a really good point generally about the way characters are perceived can be impacted by representations of that character, commentary on that character. There's no way we can't separate our reading and our imagination of a character from the way, and because Pride and Prejudice has been adapted so many times, some better than others, but all worth watching. Especially, I think, if you're studying this text, to get a bit of, because every time someone adapts the text, they make decisions about how they're going to represent the characters based on this text, and then it provides interesting avenues for discussion. I think, am I right that Death Comes to Pemberley is kind of inspired by, and I'm just at the end of the book now, that's right, the letter that Lydia sends, you think everything's okay, at the end of the novel, we think everything's okay, everyone's married, we're all happy, and then wonderful Lydia sends Elizabeth a letter and says, my dear Lizzie, I wish you joy. If you loved Mr. Darcy half as well as I do my dear Wickham, you must be very happy. It's a great comfort to have you so rich, because that means that she can get money. Right? And when you have nothing else to do, I hope you will think of us. I'm sure Wickham would like a place at court, very much, and I do not think we shall have quite money enough to live upon without some help. Any place would do, of about 300 or 400 a year. But however, do not speak to Mr. Darcy about it if you'd rather not. Yours, love, Lydia. And so, I mean, I know I talk with my students about dynamic and static characters, and Lydia is possibly one of the best representations of a static character in that she just does not learn anything despite her adventures. And so she has no idea of what Darcy's done for her.
There's this beautiful scene in Death Comes to Pemberley where Lydia is just she's screeching about the fact that her dress has been ruined because it got wet. And she does the whole, I'm so devastated, and falls back on the bed and everything just goes. And it's just, you just sit there thinking, oh my goodness, like.
What are you doing?
Yeah.
What are you doing?
Yeah.
Well, she does something similar in Pride and Prejudice, or not something similar, but when she does initially run off with Wickham, she leaves some note saying, please organise for my dress that has a huge tear in it to be fixed, and that's her last, her last comment before she runs away with this man. She's thinking about her appearance and what she's wearing, which I feel is very reflective, perhaps, of her as a character.
But it's what preoccupies her as well, isn't it? And I think that's one of the things that Austen does really well, is that all 5 of those Bennet girls have got something that makes them who they are, and that's Lydia's thing. And regardless of whether or not you like it, it's truth, because I think, I mean, and I guess leading or preempting your final question,
yes.
Part of the reason that Pride and Prejudice does stand the test of time, I suppose, is the fact that we can see that behaviour. And Lydia is a character in the 19th century, but she's also reality in the 21st century. We are so preoccupied with our appearance, and especially as a 16-year-old girl, that's kind of the thing that
dominates.
Yeah.
It does. Because I think a lot of students might approach Pride and Prejudice and think, oh, especially, if you look at it in that Penguin Classics format, you might think, oh, this isn't a book. This isn't a book for me. This isn't a book that I'm going to find interesting, or I'm going to find any sort of connection. I'm not going to see myself in this book. But actually, as you've just said, there's many characters that are just like the teenagers that are sitting in, I was going to say classrooms all over the state, but more likely their bedrooms. And they will hopefully be able to find some form of connection with these characters.
Yeah, I think one of the things that struck me when I was just rereading this was the fact that Austen relies so heavily on the dialogue, rather than on the narration, and I think that's important too, in that it's not about the story that she's telling, but the characters that she's creating. And so if you look at the dialogue, you actually pick up all of these wonderful things that you will see in 21st century society and preoccupations, whatever. One of those in particular, and I think something that the students need to look for, is the flirtation that occurs between Elizabeth and Darcy.
Yes. When she's walking around the scene when she's walking around the drawing room and they're commenting on the aspect, and
No, there was. I actually highlighted that one. He was so insightful about the fact that he says, I'm not going to join you because there's only two reasons that you could be doing that, and I will be a hindrance to both. And the first reason is that your figure looks better when you're walking.
Yes. A woman's figure, because that's ultimately what every woman is seeking to do, is to look attractive.
And I feel it too, like lockdown. I saw a meme, I don't know, it must have been right at the beginning of the first lockdown, and there was a comment about, I now understand why women in Victorian novels spent so much time walking around the room.
Yes. Because they weren't allowed to go out and exercise. Which is why, I mean, I'm getting off track. We'll come back, because I do want to look at this scene and this flirtation. Why Lizzie is such a unique character is because she will just get out and walk. She's not bothered about being out in the elements, and that definitely positions her as different.
Yeah, but also breaking all of those kind of rules and regulations about a woman stepping out without a man to be with her. I've actually found it in my copy.
Tell me.
So Miss Bingley says, Miss Eliza Bennet, let me persuade you to follow my example and take a turn about the room. I assure you it is very refreshing after sitting so long in one attitude. And then Miss Bingley asks Darcy, and he says, I have not the smallest objection to explaining them, said he, as soon as she allowed him to speak. You either choose this method of passing the evening because you are in each other's confidence and have secret affairs to discuss, or because you are conscious that your figures appear to the greatest advantage in walking. If the first, I should be completely in your way, and if the second, I can admire you much better as I sit by the fire. Oh, shocking, cried Miss Bingley. I never heard anything so abominable. How shall we punish him for such a speech?
And the thing is, Miss Bingley as well is very much wanting Mr. Darcy to admire the aspect of her figure, because she is quite, I think, interested in a potential match there, and thinks it's almost a given that that they would be that Darcy would be interested in her. And then that's right. And then Elizabeth kind of is quite, she teases him and says to him, you know, we should laugh at him because laughing at him would be possibly the worst punishment for Darcy, who she has determined to be completely prideful and
Yes.
selfish.
I love, if you move on a little bit further towards the end of the chapter, and this is
Yes.
what I highlighted, I think he says to her, there is, I believe, in every disposition a tendency to some particular evil, a natural defect which not even the best education can overcome. And your defect is a propensity to hate everybody. And yours, he replied with a smile, is willfully to misunderstand them. And I think, like, if we go back to that idea of the flirtation, that's where it starts to come in, because one thing that Austen doesn't tend to do is add those dialogue tags.
No.
She just dialogue. So the fact that she's sitting there and saying he replied with a smile is really important, yeah, because you want, and I guess especially you want your students to pick that up and go, oh yeah, I recognise that there's actually more than just a conversation going on here. There is this level of flirting which is totally different, I suppose, to the way that we flirt now, but
yes,
so much nicer. Like
it is much nicer. I like that what you've mentioned there about Austen's lack of description. I think some readers of Austen have been very frustrated by the fact that she just doesn't describe anything. There's no description of setting really, or the rooms that they're in, because the focus is, as you've said, on the dialogue and the conversation, and that's one of the beautiful elements of her. And students can make comment about this in a stylistic fashion. I think that there's a reason why Austen is so focused on dialogue, and it's because it's through that mechanism, I suppose, that she conveys her meaning.
One of the things that we talk about in because I teach literature as well, and one of the big things that we talk about in lit, and I think it gets missed a lot in English, especially in the junior levels, is the importance of setting and what the setting actually represents to a reader. The difference between indoors and outdoor settings, you know, that idea of safety being inside and security, whereas outdoors is free and what have you, and the difference between country versus city or town versus village or anything like that. And that's something you're correct in that Austen doesn't go into a lot of detail about the setting, except for when she discusses Pemberley.
Yes, that is, and the description of Pemberley is detailed, isn't it?
Yeah, it's
now I want to find it.
Yeah, I just read that bit again this morning, and I was like, she starts off talking about the forest that surrounds it and the trees and the driveway and how you travel down this area, and then all of a sudden you see this beautiful big house, and then they go on a tour through, or Lizzie and her aunt and uncle go on a tour through the estate, and they get to look at everything. And again, it's that connection between developing character through dialogue, because the housekeeper starts talking about how expensive the furniture is and how this has been done. And the only thing that Lizzie is interested in is not the house, but the things that the housekeeper has to say about Darcy. And
there's a number of very positive things to say about Darcy too.
Yes, she does. I think that's what changes Lizzie's mind.
Pemberley?
There was a comment.
Was it Pemberley that changes her mind? It's very cynical, sorry.
It is, but I don't think that in realistic terms you couldn't help but have your mind changed a little bit if you knew that that's where the person that you should be loving lived.
Yes, and the person who had not but half a book ago proposed to you, and you have turned him down.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so true.
But no, there is actually a comment there from Austen in the narration about how valuable commentary from an intelligent housekeeper is in portraying the person. And I think there's a comment there on the fact that, you know, if someone can treat their servants and their hired hands the same way as they treat the wealthier guests to their house, then that person must surely be good. And I think that's what kind of is the thing that turns Lizzie into going, oh yeah, Darcy's actually not so bad. So.
Not so bad. And she does have reports too, doesn't she, from like there's little patches of information as she's going on her tour with her aunt and uncle that she learns that challenges her initial or her first impressions, if we're to use the alternate title for the text. And I think one of the things I love most about Elizabeth Bennet as a character is that she is willing to reflect on her preconceptions and to admit that she was wrong, which is a beautiful thing and a beautiful maybe message that Austen is conveying to us, that it's okay to make a mistake. It's okay to jump to a conclusion as long as you are open to accepting that perhaps you might have been wrong a little bit.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with you there, definitely. And I think that's part of what makes the title Pride and Prejudice so much more powerful than First Impressions, because it is the pride and it's the prejudice that both Lizzie and Darcy have or seem to have and then manage to overcome throughout the entire novel that makes them perfect for each other at the end.
Indeed. I think too, on the topic of Pride and Prejudice, I'd love to talk about Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, because I think there's just a lot to say. And sometimes I think they get a little bit ignored and maybe seen in a superficial light, so that, you know, Mrs. Bennet is simply a haranguing, needy wife, and Mr. Bennet is just a quiet, maybe taciturn man. But I think that would be a limited reading of them as characters, and Austen provides much more depth for us to discuss. I'll just throw that at you and see what your thoughts were.
No, I was actually, that was on my list of things to bring up. Was
Great
how
minds.
Yes, absolutely. How underrated those two characters are. And again, I'm going to bring us back to Death Comes to Pemberley.
Oh, please do. I think what we're saying is everyone who is studying this text needs to read and watch Death Comes to Pemberley. This is just an advertising podcast for the novel, which I love. I don't mind that at all.
Oh, it's great. To be honest, I think I've seen a lot of the reproductions of it, and I honestly, Death Comes to Pemberley is probably my favourite, even though it's not actually the Pride and Prejudice story. It's afterwards. So definitely. But again, the actors that play Mr. and Mrs. Bennet in Death Comes to Pemberley are just so incredibly good, and it's those actors that influence my reading when I come back to Pride and Prejudice, because the hilarity of Mrs. Bennet, she becomes this kind of full character in Death Comes to Pemberley, rather than the negative haranguing, I suppose is the word that you used there. And that's how she appears in Pride and Prejudice. She just appears as this completely irrelevant, everyone hates her because she's not living up to the expectations of what a mother-in-law should be, and all of that stuff in the novel. But the actress that plays her in Pemberley is just she's just such light-hearted, over the top, oh my goodness, my girls, and oh goodness, and I think too, part of Death Comes to Pemberley, obviously it's P.D. James, it's a murder mystery. There's a murder in the middle of it that they have to solve. And so there's all of these scenes basically there through where Mrs. Bennet is crying over the fact that there's a dead body floating around in the bottom of Pemberley. And oh goodness, what's she going to do? And then the doctor comes in and gives her something to calm her down, and she's okay now for a moment, and then she wakes up again and she's all, oh no. And the whole time Mr. Bennet's just sitting there with a book in his hand in the library going, don't worry about it, it'll be fine.
Which was pretty much what he did in Pride and Prejudice.
Yes.
Just, you know, and I got a bit angry at him, I think. I don't know. I'm happy when he says that lovely line after Collins has proposed to Lizzie, and Lizzie goes to him and just says, I can't do it. And he says basically, well, you know, if you do marry him, if you don't marry him, your mother will never speak to you again. But if you do, I'll never speak to you again.
Yes.
Which is that support of her.
Hmm.
But after that, he's unable to do anything about the Lydia situation. Darcy has
Yeah.
to come in. Maybe
I
I'm being too tough on him.
yeah, I think you are.
Okay, no, I like that. I like that.
Because I think, I don't know, maybe not a little bit. The Mr. Bennet is just such an untypical father, though, character. Like, he's not what I think a reader in 1813 or whatever would have expected him to be, because the thought that he would have to marry off his daughters and make sure that they were looked after, especially because Longbourn is entailed to Collins.
Yes.
And, you know, so I always, from an historical perspective, I feel like Mr. Bennet is a very modern character in that he's not pushing his daughters to get married, and particularly to get married to people that they don't love.
Yeah.
The quote that you just provided then was basically, you know, it is in effect him saying to Lizzie, the choice is yours.
Yeah.
You do what you have to do. And then again at the end, when she tells him that she's going to be engaged to Darcy, his first response is, but you said you didn't like him, so why are you doing this?
Yeah.
It's not, his response is not, oh, okay, cool, he's worth this much money, which is what Mrs. Bennet's response is.
Yes.
And he spends so much time almost trying to hold on to his daughters,
Yeah.
that I think when it comes to Lydia, perhaps he is just so devastated that he hasn't been able to protect her and to keep her safe, that he doesn't know what to do. And it's only because Darcy is this incredibly well-mannered businessman and I guess Darcy's got the distance between the relationship as well. Like, he's not emotionally connected to Lydia, so he's able to step in and make those decisions and do what's right.
And has the money perhaps also to convince or to organise it with Wickham, you know, because I think he does offer Wickham some money, I think, to do the right thing.
Yes.
Yeah. He uses
Well,
Wickham's.
He settles all of Wickham's debts as well,
Yes,
though. So
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. But then also too, when you read the second proposal between Lizzie and Darcy, Darcy says to her that the only reason that he organised all of that was for her. It wasn't for the family. It was because he was trying to get back into Lizzie's good books and show Lizzie that he was an amazing, generous, whatever.
All the things that she didn't believe him to be from that initial judgment.
And again, we're talking about this text as a construction. We have to remember to come back to that at no point the characters make these decisions on their own. It's because Austen is forcing them to do this. With it, if Mr. Bennet had fixed the Lydia situation, then there would be nothing for Darcy to have done to make Elizabeth fall back in love with him.
True. We almost needed that. We needed that whole sub-narrative to occur to provide Darcy the opportunity
to prove himself.
Yes. Absolutely. Well, it's a nicer reading of Mr. Bennet than perhaps, I led with. Maybe I'll watch this film version of Death at Pemberley and change my interpretation of him. But I think maybe even Mr. Bennet, having married Mrs. Bennet when she was younger and beautiful, he's realised in his wisdom that marrying for superficial reasons is not necessarily going to lead to a lifetime of love.
Yeah. Well, but he says that to Lizzie
Yeah.
as well at the end when she tells him that she's going to be engaged
Marry.
to Darcy. That's what comes up. So yeah.
So we get that insight into his motivations, and what's motivating him. I wanted to on the topic of having, like, Mr. Bennet not having a lot of control versus Darcy having control, and then bringing in Lady Catherine into the mix, because we haven't really talked of her, and she's actually really important, I think, in the narrative. She wants her poor sickly daughter. I do feel for her. Anne, is it Anne? Yes, poor Anne de Burgh, to marry Darcy. And she's a pretty powerful woman, which at the time was unusual. Women were not able to own land, which is part of the issue with the entailment, is that the girls can't inherit the land. But I believe a widowed woman could still hold the estate of the recently, or the past husband. So that's how she has her wealth and influence. And yet she functions as a really negative character who seeks to impact Lizzie and not harm her, but put her back in her place. So from a feminist perspective, how do we, what's our read on Lady Catherine? What's our interpretation?
Look, Lady Catherine, I think the beauty of her as a character is that she's honest. She certainly doesn't try and hide behind all of those conventions of the time. You're right, she's completely got this power and this authority as well as a result of her situation, and she does everything that she possibly can do to maintain that.
Yeah.
I think the conversation between her and Lizzie when she says that, you're not to marry Darcy because he's intended for my daughter. If you read, there's a number of ways that you can read that. And the first one, I guess the most obvious reading is that it's, she's just standing there and demanding that Lizzie do exactly what she's told to do, and putting that idea of putting Lizzie in her place. But the second reading, I think, is also perhaps probably linked to Mr. Bennet's idea as well, that will Lizzie actually be happy with Darcy? Because Lady Catherine is so aware of the differences in the social circles, and she knows, well, maybe she doesn't know, maybe she just thinks, which perhaps adds to her as a slightly weird character.
Yeah.
But says that brings up that idea that, are you willing to put yourself into this position and this status in society at risk of your own heart,
Because I think that's the thing that isn't really spoken about, is that whoever does marry Mr. Darcy will be quite an influential player, in the social
hierarchy.
Yeah, hierarchy. Thank you. I was thinking milieu, and I'm like, that's not the right word. And is that going to make Lizzie happy?
Yeah.
Someone who likes reading and walking out and getting her boots dirty, and can we really imagine her in huge social events where she has to be the hostess and putting up with interminable conversations of people who are focused purely on external, appearances?
Like Miss Bingley.
Like Miss Bingley. Well, that's the thing. She's going to have to socialise with her for the rest of time. So she must really love Darcy to be willing to put up with that. I mean, we have touched a little bit on the class elements in the text and how they function. I think Austen. Do you think Austen, does she ignore the class implications of the Bennet girls and the marriages that they do make in desiring a happy ending?
That's such a hard question, really.
Yeah. I'm not sure what I think. I want you to tell me.
Look, I think, well, from a modern 21st century feminist perspective reading, I think it's just a case of Austen wanting that happy ever after beyond that class distinction, and suggesting that, by having Lydia marry Wickham, who is completely at the bottom of the rung, I suppose, Jane and Bingley kind of somewhere in the middle, and then Lizzie and Darcy being at that top end. I feel what she's suggesting there is that as long as you're happy, it doesn't matter, and that class distinctions shouldn't make any difference. And again, too, perhaps even a little bit with Charlotte and Mr. Collins, it's about what makes you happy, and going from there. If we look at it, I suppose, from the context of Austen herself, then I think she's critiquing the fact that class is so important, and that the idea that women have to be married by a certain age, and they have to be married to someone that is in the same social circle as them. And yeah, I guess, I don't know.
Especially because she never married,
Mm.
I don't think. It's ironic that all of her stories are to do with marriage. There's that classic essay topic, Pride and Prejudice is about money and marriage. Discuss, you'll get that as a really, as you see it circulate. Is that all that the book's really about?
Well, but it's about, I think, again, if we come back to construct too, she's written a book to make money. So she's looking at, she's got a very specific audience, which would be a group of women. I don't imagine that in the 19th century many men would have picked up that book.
Unlikely.
So,
yeah.
So she's writing about something that her readers are going to want to read about, which is that idea of that happy ending. And marriage would have been, or it still is, basically kind of that ideal of what makes happiness. You get married, you have children, you live a long life together. There's that societal expectation that sits in the background that says, you're not going to make money from this book if you don't write to that.
No, that's true. You make a really good point about the intent of, in her actual time, what was her purpose, I suppose, and I think thinking about the purpose of the text is really important in understanding how it is constructed, like we've talked about today. And you're right, at base level, Austen was looking to make money. She was a writer. That was her job. In the same way, perhaps, that we have, crime fiction and romance fiction and other sorts of fiction today being published, being churned out. She was just doing that, and yet she was just doing it very well. So we still read it. We read it today.
Yes. I just watched before I jumped on with you.
Oh yeah.
An episode of the ABC book club, and they had PMP, and there was Colm Tobin and Lionel Shriver on it talking about it. And Lionel Shriver was so negative about the book. She was like, no, this is just, it's boring. I can't deal with it. And Colm was very much enamored with all of Austen's stuff. And he basically said that he stole her plot template for his novel Brooklyn.
Really?
Yes. And I was like, oh, and listen to it because it's worthwhile.
Okay.
It goes for about 10 minutes. But the commentary that is raised there is that all of Austen's books follow that same format, where there's a family, a small village, the interlopers, the desire to get married and have relationships and all of that sort of stuff. And
a protagonist who perhaps thinks she knows more than she actually knows and has to learn something. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that comes back to that construct and that really important aspect. If we compare it to crime fiction in modern time, or even the idea of the rom-com film, they're all the same. They follow the same structure. It's the same template of plot that is followed, just with different characters or different setting. And that's something that we do need to keep in mind when we're studying Austen, because she was writing for a very specific audience. She was doing she was doing it to make money, not to just say, look how intelligent I am and how good a writer I am.
True. I wonder, does that bring us to, to this final question, which I ask everyone now, which is, why is this text so important, and why are we studying it? Why is some, rom-com, romance fiction writer, why are we sitting here having this beautiful conversation, and why are we studying this text? Why is it important?
Oh, so many reasons. Look, I think just because it's insightful. She's done what every good writer does and made a comment on society and what society values at her time. And there's just the fortunate comparison there that those things are also still valued in our time. They're not, they're kind of those everlasting themes and ideas, the views and the values of what goes on, and they are constantly represented. She's done it very well.
She has. She's done it very, very well. Better than most, which is why we're still studying it. Prue, thank you so much. I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and I think this will be the case for all the conversations I have. We could keep talking about this for another hour. But just in the interests of our listeners, probably we should finish it off. Thank you for coming today.